In a previous discussion, we looked at hormonal control of the endocrine system, whereby endocrine glands release hormones in response to hormones produced by other endocrine glands. We use the example of the hypothalamus releasing thyroid-stimulating releasing hormone to communicate with the anterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary, in response, then produces and releases thyroid-stimulating hormone, which eventually talks to the thyroid, and the thyroid releases thyroid hormone, which is released out into the body to increase metabolism. Here we have a cascade of one hormone controlling the release of another hormone. This cascade usually starts with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is kind of like the master control center that helps coordinate activities between the nervous and the endocrine systems. Because the hypothalamus is a neuroendocrine organ, it is partially made of nervous tissue and is part of the central nervous system, but it's also partially made of glandular tissue that produces and secretes certain hormones. Inferior to the hypothalamus is another organ called the pituitary, which has two large lobes to it. One side, called the posterior pituitary, is a direct physical connection to the hypothalamus, and the other side is called the anterior pituitary, which, while it is connected to the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary, is controlled in a totally different way and is almost entirely made out of glandular kinds of tissues. The posterior pituitary is largely composed of neural tissues. The posterior pituitary stores and releases a couple of neurohormones called oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone, abbreviated as ADH. These neurohormones, oxytocin and ADH, are actually produced in the hypothalamus and then transported down the length of the neurons, where they are stored at the neural terminus, waiting for a signal to release those hormones directly into the bloodstream. The anterior pituitary, on the other hand, is glandular tissue. It is, for the most part, controlled by hormones released by the hypothalamus. Those hormones can be considered either releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. Here, the blank part of the name tells us what hormone is going to be released or inhibited. Our example earlier was thyroid-stimulating releasing hormone that's released from the hypothalamus and tells the anterior pituitary to release thyroid-stimulating hormone. That's why it's called a releasing hormone. The good news about this is, for the most part, anytime we see a hormone name that ends in the abbreviation RH, that portion of the name already tells us something useful. If it's a releasing hormone, it is coming from the hypothalamus and normally going to the anterior pituitary to tell the anterior pituitary to release something. Just that portion of its name, RH, tells us where this hormone comes from, where it goes to, and part of what it does. Once the anterior pituitary receives these signals, it can release 6 different hormones: growth hormone, thyroid-stimulating hormone, adrenocorticotropic hormone, the gonadotropins, which are follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, and prolactin. These hormones each have their own releasing hormone that comes from the hypothalamus and tells the anterior pituitary when to release them.